Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations. What am I called? Where are we? Where Conversations on? I never am I doing conversations for showing up for kids, but then I remember it's during the day, so there's no kids. So it's Conversations on showing up for kids. I am director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs, and today we have Eva Shaw with us, and we are going to talk about the fact that school has started. In case you missed it, is if your kid is still home every day, you're either homeschooling or something is not going the way that it's supposed to, which is possible. We know that school has started. Not everything goes according to plan. Some of our kids who are getting the support that special education can bring to them, we may have some concerns, and we're going to talk about some of that today. And so I'm really excited that Eva Shaw is with us. Eva, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself before I start peppering you with questions?
Sure, let me get a word in. So I'm Eva Shaw. I'm a consultant on the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. And my primary role is around social emotional learning for students with disabilities, students commonly identified with autism or emotional behavioral disabilities.
And I won't even tell you to quote the numbers, although I know you could, but that's not the concern today. What's concern today is we know a lot of IEPs get done, the individualized education planning get done in the spring, and that's sort of the roadmap for that child's individual education about how they are going to be supported in their learning and what special accommodations and supports they need to be able to access learning and to be a part of that classroom, part of that school. Well, we also know that kids change. Sometimes they change over the summer, sometimes they change because they're growing, and the school setting might change. And so there might even be a school that looks there and has this IEP, and they're like, wait a minute, there's something else going on here. Or the family's in there going, oh, you guys don't understand. The summer was just something else. And we have some more concerns we need to talk to you about. And the IEP just doesn't seem to be fitting. What can families do when they have concerns that the IEP doesn't fit? And what can the school do when there's concerns?
Well, there's a lot of answers to those questions. I'm going to start with the idea that, yeah, a lot can change over the summer. And also there has to be that time of transition. We know some students start the school year confident and ready. And if there's a change in buildings, if there's a change in grade level, well, there should be a change in grade level, a change in teachers, any of those kind of changes, we certainly have to give the student some space and grace for adapting to all those changes before we immediately want to start tweaking the IEP. So certainly giving that space and grace for transitions, for changing in the new school year.
And
Um,
Eva, before you get off of that, I just want to emphasize that because I am one of those children who has autism, and change was hard. The start of the new year, learning the new routines, where is the visual schedule, what follows math this year, and there's a lot for them to readjust to, and it may take them a little while to get back into their routines, but a lot of them will just naturally go back to the routine with that repetition of it.
with time, right? With giving them some time. And I know that even all teachers make time for that time, that they recognize that at the beginning of the school year, we might not be digging into some really deep academic instruction, because right now it's about relationship building. It's about teaching the routines, about practicing the expectations. So, giving all that time, all that space and grace for those new things that are happening in the beginning of the school year. And then after we have had that transition time, and parents know their child best, and they know that generally, it takes 2 to 3 weeks or a month for the child to really start to feel confident and have those relationships. And yet still things aren't right, things don't seem right, and there seems to be maybe it is about concerns, or maybe it's about like really great progress. Over the summer they just did leaps and bounds in learning some skills, academic or social emotional learning or whatever, communication. And so now, we're looking at this IEP that seems a little outdated. It was maybe written in March, and now here we are beginning end of September, beginning of October already. What do we do? And it's, again, it comes down to not only our teachers building relationships with their students, but we also have to be building relationships with our families. And families should be building relationships with schools too. So if you are a parent and you have concerns, you would certainly want to look at who your child's case manager is, who is the, go-to person who's implementing that IEP, be it the special education teacher or the speech language pathologist, and reaching out to that person and expressing your concerns, either through email or a phone conversation, just sharing your concerns and asking whether or not those concerns are also seen at school, or if it's just something that's coming to home too, because we see that a lot, where students really are managing and maintaining in the school setting, and then they come home and they're letting it all out. They're exhausted from maintaining that 6 to 7 hours of learning, and they come home and kind of take it out on mom and dad. And as a mom, I've lived through that, where they're great at school and come home and they're exhausted and cranky or whatever is happening. So having that really good line of communication with the school staff, with the general education teacher, with the IEP case manager, and then just seeing if those concerns are shared both ways or if they're only in one environment, in one setting, and then going from there. If the concerns are something that are shared, if school is also seeing those concerns, or even if they're not, that school has to recognize that what parents are experiencing is valid as well. And families have to recognize what school is experiencing is valid as well. It's two-way communication. But if through that conversation, the parent feels that there's strong enough evidence of concerns, they can request an IEP at any time. Those of us who live in the world of special education know that IEPs have to be rewritten once a year, have to absolutely be revisited at least once a year. But again, if there's that great growth or concerns, they can be revisited at any time. And the parent would just need to request that the IEP team reconvene so we can all get on the same page about this growth or these concerns, and then really have that good conversation as a team about how we want to move forward, and what our next steps are within that IEP process. So it's just asking for that meeting, asking and sharing the concerns, why you want to meet.
And I love the fact that you talk to that case manager first and see what the school is seeing, family seeing what that common ground is. But then being able to relook at that IEP, I think is really important, because there could be a different relationship and different interaction with teachers, that the plan worked great for the people that were surrounding that child in the spring, but they're in an entirely new environment. And maybe that support is going to look differently. Maybe they're going to need slightly different people involved to be able to get them to where the IEP wants to go. So making sure that the right people are also being involved in what that child needs to access learning.
And if there are those changes in staff, because of whatever reasons, obviously grade change, but if there are other changes too, then it's great for that IEP team to go back and have conversations with the previous adults and why was it working there, and what supports were in place that maybe were missing, some subtle things that might not be included in the IEP. It just is that constant communication around looking at our environment, looking at our the physical environment, looking at the peers around them, and just figuring out where were the great bright spots previously and how can we replicate those bright spots in the new setting, in the new context.
Exactly. How can how can we build on the strengths even though the setting is different? I really like that. So let's say families notice there's a concern, they've talked to the case manager and they think there needs to be a revision to the IEP. How do families request another IEP meeting so that the school understands now, not next spring, not the annual, I mean now?
Yeah. again, that it's always best to put any kind of request in writing. And if you have email, you can certainly email the case manager and just explain why you want that IEP meeting, what your concerns are. And again, concerns don't have to mean that there are concerns. Your concerns could be that
Right.
there's great growth, right? Great growth.
Exactly. Could
Yeah.
we please go back to the regular English curriculum, because the kid devoured books this summer,
Yeah.
because some kids reading clicks and all of a sudden they become readers. And so it could be the case like that, that all of a sudden this kid has become a reader. So let's revisit the supports around that, because we may be able to lessen some of those supports.
Yeah, and developmentally, kids can also take leaps and bounds, even socially or, in their perception or their, perspective taking or whatever the skill is, they can take leaps and bounds. So if it's as a family member, you would just want to reach out to that case manager through email if possible, or, write a note and just say you're requesting a review revised IEP meeting because Jay is demonstrating this. He's made leaps and bounds in reading over the summer, and we really are looking at the IEP goal around reading and the services around reading instruction, and it just doesn't fit, where it doesn't seem to align with his newfound skills. Or maybe the child's really struggling with transition this year and is really withdrawing because things are so different. And we really need to look at some of the services and supports to make that child feel safe and confident in their new learning environment. So, whatever you're observing as the concern, whether it's growth or needs, stating that in the letter, and it doesn't have to be in any kind of specialized terms, or it's just, here's, I would like us to meet, and here's why I'd like to meet. The goals don't seem to align and the service time maybe isn't right. So it's just really it's knowing who that case manager is and reaching out to that case manager and requesting that IEP meeting to review, revise, goals and services.
Now, it's been a few years, because my son is now in his middle 20s. So it's been a few years since I read an IEP. Well, I've looked over other people's life, but since my son had an IEP and I was part of this IEP team. Is it now very easily identifiable who that case manager is, who that first point of contact is, or how can families figure that out if they're confused?
It should be. You should, as a parent, a family member, should have a copy of the IEP. And I would really recommend that families have that copy. And again, not that they need to know all the different sections, and
Right.
sometimes it can be cumbersome. But on that IEP, it identifies all the IEP team members. And granted, it would have been a last year's IEP, but you would look at who that case manager is, who the special education teacher is, and that would be the first person to reach out to. If there was a change, best practice, and I recognize people get busy, but if there was a change of case manager, that case manager should have reached out to the family and said, I am your son or daughter's special education case manager. I am your point of contact. If you don't have that point of contact, go to the building administrator and ask who that is. Go to the school office and say, I'd like to know who my child's special education case manager is, and get that information. But hopefully they've reached out to you. Like I said earlier, it's two-way, but really the
Mhm.
school should be initiating that first point of contact, because that's school's responsibility to make sure who your child is being supported by.
All right. So let's say a parent puts that desire in writing to re-engage the IEP team, to talk about growth, to talk about maybe some struggles. What's going to happen next?
The case manager would then certainly reach out and find out good times. If it's a student with some complex needs with multiple people on that IEP team, that's about coordinating a lot of schedules. And again, it really depends on the student and the student's services, how many people are involved, how quickly that IEP team can be pulled together. But it really reasonably should be within a couple of weeks that IEP team meeting could be held. I mean, that's a reasonable expectation.
And again, that's where both parties, that two-way communication. is that understanding of flexibility. And, I can tell you sometimes I have trouble finding an ideal team to meet with one other person, much less five,
Yeah,
six,
yeah,
seven. And so both sides have got to be able to be a little bit flexible and understand that each side is giving a little. And it always feels better to me when I don't have somebody who's sitting there going, well, this is your only option.
yeah,
I'm like,
yeah,
well, you're not really engaged in this as a relationship, are you? So when you have that feeling that we're in this together, this is our team, and we're trying to get it so that everybody who needs to be there can be there, it's just such a different feeling.
yeah. And that takes, I mean, I think that takes relationships take work, right? And that takes
Yeah.
work on both of our, as a mom and as a special educator, I can see both sides, right? As a mom, this is my baby, this is my only child. I need you to do this now. And as an educator, as a special educator, I would say to the parent, yeah, but I have 16 other kids or 25 other students I have to attend to as well. Please remember, I need to juggle both. So you can certainly, I mean, we have to see both sides as adults, right? And always putting that child's needs in the center, always recognizing that we're there to, not deal with us, but to figure out how to best support the child.
Yeah. One of the best analogies that I've ever heard for the interaction with parents and teachers around the realm of special ed is with Janice Fialka. And she talks about the dance of partnership, and that we need to be in tune with each other. We need to realize we have different skill levels. We need to realize sometimes to see if we're actually listening to the same music. Because if
Yeah.
we're not on the same page, our dancing is going to be entirely different. And so everything that we do to be able to dance together is part of that partnership that families can have with the schools, and that understanding, that communication, the respect, and the flexibility come through.
Yeah. And then we're all experts at the table, right? We are all
Right.
experts on this child, but from very, very different perspectives. So we have to recognize that as well, too. Families are experts, educators are experts. We just have to recognize the expertise that everyone brings to the table. Students are experts, they should be involved
Mm-hmm.
to the greatest extent possible in that IEP, what's appropriate for their age and their developmental levels. So they should also have a voice at the table.
Love that. Forgot to mention that. Thank you. Absolutely, positively.
Mhm.
Now, the question that comes up with does everything need this meeting of the brains? Are there things that can happen with families at schools that don't need the full-blown IEP team to meet to help this child at this moment?
Yep, absolutely. So just like, teachers aren't asking, every time they tweak something for an IEP meeting, same with if families are asking too. The time that we need a meeting is when we're really questioning whether or not those goals are appropriate and whether or not those service times are appropriate. And again, that's dependent on that student's growth or lack of growth, that we would want to revisit. So knowing your students or your child's goals and service time are important. Those absolutely have to have a meeting,
Mhm.
as well as placement. If we disagree with if we think that right now, maybe the IEP says that they're getting reading instruction, and that reading instruction is going to take place, as our early example, let's say the IEP says that we're going to do 2 times a week reading instruction for 30 minutes, and we're going to do a pull-out model because we really think that that child needs a smaller group setting to minimize distractions and provide more opportunities for feedback. But the child's made huge growth, and now we're thinking
Right.
maybe that placement needs to change, and it doesn't need to be pull out. Maybe that specialized instruction needs to be in the general education setting, and so that would require a meeting. There are certain things within the IEP that absolutely require a meeting, but there are other things that don't need a meeting. Maybe it's just as like an example, maybe it's a child who's working on a goal of self-awareness. um, they're working on recognizing and labeling the emotions of themselves and others, and mom or dad wants to share that, boy, this student's really into, I don't know, current characters, Mario Brothers. I don't know, maybe that's not
Oh,
current.
that's Mario never goes away.
Okay. All right.
Mario's
Good.
still there.
Okay. So mom says, I know you're working on this goal of, recognizing and labeling basic emotions. I just wanted to share with you that this summer he's developed this great passion for Mario. Maybe you could use Mario as an example for recognizing emotions in others. And maybe you
Mhm.
want to incorporate Mario into some of your lessons because he's super engaged and connected to that character. And that wouldn't require an IEP meeting because that's not changing goals or services. It's just trying to add that child's interests into the instruction. So that's something that you wouldn't need to do for an IEP meeting. That's just a sharing of who we know this child is and their strengths and interests.
And so there's also that ongoing communication because we know kids have good days and bad days, and sometimes they get sick, which throws everything
Mhm.
off. I know when my body isn't doing well, I'm less effective, less engaged, less fun to be around. And so keeping that communication line going both ways so that, you know, I I would think that an educator would appreciate knowing that if a child's going to have a procedure or something, they may be a little off for the next week or so. So we expect to have some variability. But if there's still variability that second week, let's talk about what's going on because I need to know that as a parent. I need to know whether they have readjusted. And so ongoing communication is, I think, really important as well. Not the topic of today, but still really important.
And I do think, I mean, it lines up with the topic of today because if you have that ongoing communication, then you know who that case manager is, right? Like if you have that ongoing communication. And then, I mean, some students really require more frequent communication, and maybe that's written into the IEP, or maybe that's just an informal agreement with the family and the teachers to provide a notebook that goes back and forth because of some complex needs or just there's changes in going on in the family that we want to make sure the teachers are aware so they can better support that child.
Mhm.
Um, so that communication is again dependent on that child and that family situation and that school. It's going to look so different for every student, but that's special education is all about flexibility and meeting the individual needs of that child.
That's right.
So,
Keeping the eye in the IEP.
yep, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I want to take a break here briefly to ask if there are any questions that are out there. I almost said to thank our sponsors, but then I remembered we don't have any sponsors. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. Feel free to unmute. We would also like any discussion points. You don't have to have a question. If you have an experience, if you have something to contribute to the conversation, we would love to be able to engage with that as well. So Eva, as you were talking about the different things, when you need an IEP meeting, when you don't, I do a lot of work with families whose kids are in transition and they're transitioning, looking at transitioning out of high school, going somewhere else, and they fill out a post-secondary transition plan, which my understanding is that that's not the same as the individualized education plan. And so if it's a question about the PTP, does the whole IEP team have to meet to
That
think
oh,
about
sorry.
that?
Yep. So I was jumping in. Sorry, Tim.
No,
Yeah,
no.
well, that's part of the IEP. So that is part of that IEP
Okay.
cycle. And honestly, I have never worked at the secondary level. I've only worked through middle school. I won't talk about my student teaching days so many years ago that I did do high school, but so I'm not as familiar with PTPs. And other than I know that they are addressed annually with the annual IEP. And they're really just to help students kind of look ahead, students and families and schools look ahead to those goals, where that student wants to be, where that young adult wants to be once they leave high school, what their goals are outside of high school. But it is through that IEP process and looking at that IEP, how if the IEP goals align to those post-secondary transition goals and making sure that we're, if this is a child, a student who wants to go to college, that we're making sure
Mhm.
that our coursework is college bound and that the IEP is supporting that uh, goal as well. So that is part of that IEP.
I love that the goal should make sure that they're taking the family and the student in the same direction. That
Yeah,
they're trying to reach the same place. As I also know that parents will come across other things such as behavioral intervention plans, and there could be other things, and it's important to, again, I would say, talk to your case manager about what are those things that are a meeting with the case manager versus the, like you say, the changing in the scope or the number of times or the goals, the overarching goals of the IEP. You don't always need to bring everybody together. Sometimes you could do it with a smaller group. You just have to be clear and communicate what your need is, and then the school has to let you know legally how can that be done.
I think that's a great thing, being clear, because if it's just that informal conversation about some things that are tweaking, that we are tweaking or talking about that are related to the, services and supports, the times, the goals, that sort of thing, versus if we're really looking at this isn't working, we need to open up the IEP and relook at those services and supports. And you brought up a really good example is that behavior intervention plan. If a student does have a behavior intervention plan, which is something that should be is attached to the IEP, and that behavior intervention plan oftentimes has more details than what the IEP would uh, list out. It might be a reinforcement schedule, or it might be a specific adult response. They can look very different to support a child whose behavior might be interfering with their learning or the learning of others. That behavior intervention plan um, is attached to the IEP, and depending how it's written, it may require an IEP meeting to really revise that behavior intervention plan. If it's just about adult response and we're tweaking adult response and not services and supports, then you could relook at that behavior intervention plan.
Cool. All right. I am not seeing any questions in the chat or unmuting. Matter of fact, chat is letting us know that we don't have any questions. So this is exactly what I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to make this information available to families. So we don't need to go on and on and on, as much as I love talking. But any last thing, the last thing that I want to say is communication, flexibility, respect. Communication, flexibility, respect. What do you have to leave us, Arniva?
I think I would second that. I think it's just about keeping those lines of communication open, um, and just holding that space for grace, that that we all are coming from a different perspective and we just have to respect that. But yeah, communication is key to really help that child move forward. If all the adults, including that student, all that IEP team are communicating regularly, it can only help to serve that child and help them reach their goals.
Which is what we want. We
Yeah.
want the children to achieve as much as they can. Well, thank you all for being here. Eva, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here. And I know that this format is not exactly everybody's favorite. You did a fantastic job. If people wouldn't mind just quickly clicking the link for the feedback, as we do look at all the feedback to see how we're doing. Are the topics hitting the mark, or the topics not hitting the mark? All later.